All right, in this video, we dive into the gothic horror of Nikolai Gogol, better known as the Ukrainian Edgar Allan Poe to some. Welcome to the CodeX Cantina, where I am Una.
And I am Terrible Crypto?
You can read for free. We are going to put a link in the description below. And we got even a friend, Brad Proctor, who is joining us on this read too as well. And I'll put a link to his channel as well, who does more of the horror gothic side of things, while we tend to focus more on the literary side. Let's see what the two different views of this story come out to be. Now, this was published in 1832 in the second volumes of Evenings on a Farm near Dekanka. And forgive me for our pronunciations. Unfortunately, I don't speak the language, and I'm going to be really bad at pronouncing these, but we promise only our best. But this is a collection of Ukrainian pieces, and some say they are based more on his own demons than actual folklore.
So the first thing we need to talk about is the author himself, Nikolai Gogol, and I'll probably just say Nikolai, or because I'm going to mess up his last name every single time. So we talk a little about his background, and that he is raised in a bilingual home, kind of claimed from both sides of his Ukrainian descent and his Russian descent.
He was born in the middle of the Romantic movement, interestingly enough, in 1809, the same year that Edgar Allan Poe was born.
And to remember that a lot of the writers during this time period were focusing in on very spiritual, emotional writing, realism, and things like that during this time period. One thing that also in the early 19th century was individualism as an upcoming rising thing. It's becoming the superstar of writing.
Where I think he tries to create monsters, or at least monstrous actions out of men in his writing. And with that said, this piece was actually recommended to us by a friend of mine that reads literature as well. And he said why this piece he'd recommend it is because the writing is so different from the rest of Gogol. Now, I have read, I think it's called The Overcoat. It's his most famous work. We're going to cover that later on this year, along with The Night Before Christmas. But he said this piece specifically is really interesting with the way the author has very archaic and just different choices that he makes in the prose that he exercises here. And I couldn't agree more. I had no idea that I would never have guessed this was a Gogol story based on the prose.
Yeah. And one last thing to talk about real quick before we get into the plot discussion of the story is that this story is kind of broken down into thirds, and the last third is the most important piece because that's where you actually get the story of what happens. So part one, real quick, is going to be kind of a list of who's who, and we get all these characters, and then we get the two main characters, and then the middle part is very, very confusing, and then the third part is the actual story.
It's always fun when stories end with the beginning, right?
Yeah, we're used to that around here, so we're okay with it.
All right, so for plot, I'm going to do this kind of quick, but we do need to touch on some pieces because I know it has been expressed that some parts of the story are confusing, so let's touch on some of the milestones. We open up at a wedding, and a recently married couple, Danilo Burobash and Katarina, are in attendance. A dancing Cossack is revealed to be a sorcerer when religious icons are displayed before him. And they go through some really weird things, such as going to a zombie-infested graveyard and having a saber fight with the father-in-law. It's just what happens. But
it's a very interesting story.
Getting to more of the plot, though, is that night Danilo sees some light coming from a sorcerer's castle nearby, and he decides to investigate. So he brings his friend, and that's where he sees his father-in-law transform into the evil sorcerer that was at the wedding earlier, and he's summoning up the soul of Katarina, but Katarina claims that it's not her father, and yeah, this is one of those stories.
But she's pretty convincing, though. They leave.
So he leaves, goes back, and his wife's like, "You won't believe this dream I have." And he's like, "You won't believe what I just saw." And their stories match up perfectly. And he kind of just sweeps everything under the rug, doesn't really listen to her. Throughout this whole story, he doesn't really listen to his wife at all.
Yeah, we're talking about that.
Later on, the Cossacks go back to the castle to get the sorcerer. They lock him up in Danilo's basement, because that's what you do when you get an evil sorcerer.
This is like the play-by-play book of how to do things poorly when fighting an adversary.
Yeah, right. And then let the daughter of the man that you have imprisoned roam freely by unsupervised and release him from prison because he promises to repent. So soon the sorcerer sends local Polish individuals to attack Danilo's castle in a raid, but they're defeated by the Cossacks. A lot of pro-Cossack movement in this. And the sorcerer shoots Danilo. And in Kiev, Katerina has a dream that her baby has died. She wakes up. Her baby's dead. This is just what happens.
Whew. It's a rough go. It's a rough go.
Yeah. So Katerina kind of goes a little crazy, and a stranger soon arrives at the house and claims to have served with Danilo, and that if Danilo were to die, she should totally marry him, right? There's probably a religious or background there that I didn't investigate, but she's like, no, Dad, I know it's you. And she tries to kill him in a very phallic manner with her knife, and he overpowers her naturally, because men always overpower women in old 1800
sarcasm
in old 1800 Ukrainian stories. There's a very famous passage in here, I guess, about the Dnieper River. And later, the sorcerer sees an image of the knight holding the baby. He heads to the monastery of the caves and kills all of them when they won't help him. The knight kind of catches up with the sorcerer, casts him into the abyss where his ancestors gnaw on his bones. And that's where you get to the third part that Crypto was talking about earlier, like, hey, this is confusing. Yeah, this is kind of how the story was just written, where you get the backstory about the two brothers, Ivan and Petro, where Petro kills Ivan one day, and Ivan kind of has God curse his family for killing him, saying all of his ancestors would go through terrible misfortune. They'd gnaw on his bones, etc., etc. Kind of giving a little bit more context to maybe some of the strange things that were happening in the second part of the story.
So let's move on to then our analysis part here. And what I want to talk about are two major themes. I want to talk about mental health and gender roles. And we're going to talk a little bit about religion at the very, very end. So the first thing I want to talk about is masculinity versus femininity. And this story is ripe with awful, awful stereotypes. And I think that it explores a lot about gender roles throughout the story. I think old Nikolai here was giving us a cautionary tale of an acceptance, especially with family members. To start off, kind of here is a quote that I have from the story, and it says, "I am long past the age of being swaddled by women. I can seat a horse. I can wield a sharp saber with my hand. I can do a thing or two besides, ... And I think that one thing is that in the story, the men are obviously portrayed as like the heroes in so many tales and sagas, and I feel like that he's really trying to get across this utility. Like these guys are like Swiss Army knives; they can do everything, and they don't need a woman's help. And it's very belittling to the women. And you can see where Katerina throughout the story is just put down over and over and over again. And this is going to bring me to my point of gender roles and the idea of that she isn't accepting of herself and her own gender identity because of what these men have done to her throughout the story and her life.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you that just to touch further on that men with utility, that is their self-worth in these relationships and in life is I can ride a horse, right? Like in terms of the Cossacks being the Wild West cowboys, we have sabers, we're democratic, we vote, and we do things, right? Like their value comes from the things that they do, not what they are.
Yeah, and we've seen this in many stories where these items or the ability to do something specific is what gives you power or meaning to your life. And that's very, very significant as we kind of go through here with my view of one of the very, very deep underlying tones of this story. And maybe its underlying theme of what he might have meant and not just what is on the surface that we'll talk about because that's important because it is a cool little story, with the vampires and the zombies and everything. But I think there is more to this story. So another quote to kind of support that here is when Danilo is talking to his wife and how belittling and horrible he is to her is when he says, "Silence, woman!" Danilo said angrily. "Whoever deals with you becomes a woman himself." Whoa, right?
Yeah, the idea that when he's very clearly putting them on the pedestal below, right? Like if I deal with this lowliness, I will become as low as you, because what he's saying.
Yeah, and he's saying that to be a woman is low, is lesser than. And this is where we get into the idea that Katerina is lesser than, and she starts to believe that herself. And then we have these phallic symbols coming up that maybe she was transgendered, or maybe she, had like penis envy or something, and we see that symbol in the knife throughout the story as well, as it's come back as the sabers and the knives representing these phallic symbols. And
well, would you say, I can't remember the exact wordings, but she reached for did they describe it as like a phallic knife? Like they very clearly used masculine symbols when talking about that struggle, right? How she was reaching for the knife, and then she was overpowered by the man to the plot synopsis, right?
Yeah, that she was going to be this phallic woman as well. And I think that points to her with this struggle between her femininity and her masculinity throughout the story. And there is this odd relationship between the sorcerer, her dad, and her, right? Because there is a touch of this idea that he's trying to trick her into being with him. So he wants his own daughter. And that in itself is its own set of subset.
Well, I wasn't expecting to get into an Oedipal story when this was recommended by a friend. That was kind of shocking.
Yeah, and I think there is a little bit of that there. And again, it's not something huge, but you can definitely see that it kind of wrapped up in this web here. And one of the things that comes out as well at the end is some religious tones. And just real quick, you could almost see this as the main story as like a Cain and Abel at the very, very end with the two brothers. And not a lot there, but again, there's some religious stuff as we go through. But I think it comes back to how religion is definitely oppressing through the men onto the women. And in that, they're not accepting of these women, and specifically, they're not accepting of Katrina, who could be transgender. We really don't know.
That, or she is having masculine attributes put on her, right? If we look at Gogol's life, he's come out as saying that he was raised in a heavily religious family, where he himself said he just went along with the motions. Like he wasn't a strong believer himself, but he was placed into that role by his family, right? In the same way that I feel like he's trying to express women are placed into certain roles or certain activities throughout this piece, and how they're constant. Their needs are not attended to, right? The priority is always the man's, as through the lens of this story, and how that kind of oppresses, I guess, Katerina in a sense. I think like you can kind of see that through this.
Yeah, and I think that comes from this idea that in many religions and in the Bible, the man is the head of the household, and there are views on that the man should be making all the decisions. And from this story, it says, Master Danilo locked me in my room and take the key with you. I won't be so afraid then. And I think that this is idea of that man is the protector of the wife, of the family as well. And I think that Nikolai's own personal is kind of bleeding into the story here.
It's interesting because I don't know much about Russia and Ukraine around 1832. I don't know much about what struggle. I mean, obviously, we know that it was a very masculine-driven environment. What I don't know is the gender side of things, in terms of, obviously the masculinity is overriding things. What did that do to the women? What did that do to maybe the people that were having the masculinity put onto them? I don't know if it was transgender or not problems back then, but you can definitely feel how the assignment of utility and masculinity is put onto everyone in the story.
Yeah, and people aren't being accepted for who they are. And so maybe there is none of that other stuff we talked about, and maybe we're drawing too far out there. I think there's a good argument for it, and there's plenty of symbology and wordage in there to support that. But I think what it comes down to is that he is not accepting of who his daughter is, and he wants to change her.
Right, and he doesn't, and he doesn't listen to her, right?
No. Okay. They say, we're not going to listen to you.
Now for mine's real quick on some of the Ukrainian background. So part of this project was to get closer to kind of the Eastern Slavic, to the Russian cultures and such like that. And obviously Ukrainian being and Russia both claiming this. But the idea was to get closer to this. And I was really interested in how they said this is based on local folklore, but no local folklore is the specific source for that. So I started doing some research into monsters and the symbology of monsters. And I'll put a link down below because I didn't want to go the usual religious route. I feel like it's, looking at the Christian Orthodox and Catholic Church. I thought that was kind of interesting. But for this video, I kind of wanted to dive more into the local folklore because I thought that was appropriate for the purpose of this project.
Sure.
And I'm going to put a link to vampire folklore by region. And I started looking into vampires. I started looking into werewolves. Like, what do Ukrainians and Russians believe in terms of like what their vampire or werewolf lore is? And it's kind of interesting when you look at these articles. And there's actually a lot of similarities that I've noticed from the American version of it too.
That's probably where we got most of ours is from them, right?
I have no idea, actually. I mean, a lot of them are based in Europe, but I don't know if that's European in origin, right? That might just be the location. What I thought was interesting from the wiki, it says some of the more common causes of vampiricism in Slavic folklore include being a magician or an immoral person. And I think that's interesting when you kind of apply that to this story, when you think about that sorcerer potentially have being a vampire or werewolf, a super monster, supernatural effect in the story. If I may draw the conclusion, that you'll notice that the hero goes out at night to explore the castle, right? He sees that light, and that's a lot of the times when you see the vampires or the supernatural elements come out, such as werewolves. They're only visible at nighttime under the full moon, right?
Yeah.
And then we have the graveyard, where we have the reanimated corpses, and we have a representation of evil. Evil is coming for you, whether it be at night or whether it be in these corpses in the graveyard. There's very specific sources of evil in this, which apparently is very common in Ukrainian and Slavic cultures as well. The sorcerer is a shapeshifter. Now, when you compare that to the werewolf or to the vampire of our lores, it's also true for them, where the idea is that evil can take form in any shape. Evil comes for you in different shapes and forms, that you have to always be vigilant for how evil comes for you is kind of a big overriding theme of how evil transforms.
Right.
And then the last is sensual activity. So much like in the way that a lot of vampire things are considered very sensual or sexual, we have some very interesting commentary here on the phallic symbology.
Yeah, we do.
About penetration and stuff like that, about how the incestuous thing of won't you be with me, from the vampire, the evil sorcerer, supernatural being, to the only really defined young woman in the story that gets a personality, if you will.
Katarina.
So even that kind of rings true as well. So I just thought that was kind of interesting to see some of the influences from local supernatural lore kind of brought out in the story. And I can kind of see now why they said, hey, it draws from local folklore, but it's not a specific story, but it's using all of these elements of like the nighttime, how evil comes for you, a definable evil, sources and places of evil. Very, very interesting the way that it was kind of pulled off.
It is definitely unique, that's for sure. I never read a story like this before.
So let's move into, so that's kind of the analysis where we like to talk about interpretations, meanings, maybe kind of what the things can be pulled out from. Let's move more to the subjective side of things, because let me first challenge you with, what would be the one word you would use to describe this story?
And I can't use the word terrible?
No, you cannot use the word terrible.
I always tell my students that all the time. I was like, you can't use the question side of the answer. I don't want to be too negative about it, so I'm going to say unique.
I would say enigmatic.
Okay.
This is different culture in terms of the clear Catholicism, Catholic, Cossack commentary. Arguably, maybe some masculinity, femininity roles hidden in there, the supernatural lore. It's not on the surface, right?
Yeah.
And even the writing is super archaic and aggressive. This is a writer, at least this story, I should say, because I know this writing is different from his usual stories. The amount of exclamation points in this story would make Charles Dickens blush, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I thought I was going to have a headache from all the time I was like reading in my head, yelling at myself. I was giving myself a migraine.
So I would say I look forward to seeing what Brad's reaction is from a traditional horror gothic side, because that's not our jam. Typically, we're more on the literary side. I would definitely say for me, this just a subjective, what did I think about it? This really didn't hit the buttons for me. That this was probably more like a 3.5 out of 10 for me is what I would rate it.
Yeah, so sticking again with our subjective numbers, and this may mean nothing to you, it's something here that I would give this maybe like a 4 for me. Again, kind of in that venue where I really didn't like it or enjoy it, but we talked a lot about it, and I think there's some good stuff here. And this does, and the main thing here, this doesn't turn me off from Nikolai Gogol and his writings. I want to read his other stuff, because if this is like the worst of the worst, which again isn't like terrible, see what I did there? Is you knew I had to do it once. It intrigues me that I want to read more of his things, because I think we're only going to go up from here. And he's obviously a very talented writer and has an ability to put some stuff in there that we enjoy breaking down. So, from that aspect, maybe we give it an 8 or a 9, but for an enjoyment, I rate it lower.
No, I agree. The enjoyment was low, but the discussion quality was very high. I can vouch for the overcoat, which I said we're going to do again later on this year. And we'll see what we get into with the Nightmare Before Christmas, or the Night Before Christmas, I should say, as we approach more Gogol throughout the years.
Cool.
All right, guys, thank you so much for checking this out. Kind of a fun experiment, kind of trying new things. I think this was an interesting Ukrainian-Russian tale. Our first for the month, celebrating all of the Russian short stories this month. So, guys, please consider subscribing if you enjoy having literature discussions and talking a little bit more about maybe some of the deeper meanings behind things. Una out.
Peace. Are you gonna give me some height too, so I can be 5'10"?
You can be whatever you want to be. It's the internet. No one tells the truth on here.
I do. That's why I'm sitting on a pillow, giving myself a few extra inches.